Okay, hello and welcome to our third webinar in our series on corporate governance. This is going to be our final webinar on corporate governance today, but we're certainly going to have other webinars coming up throughout the year, so make sure to keep your eyes open for those. My name is Vaughn Lawrence, and I'm the Director of Communications and Technology for PAMIC. As an organization, PAMIC is focused on providing timely education on insurance-based issues, and these webinars give us an excellent opportunity to interface with our members and non-members in a new way. Before we begin, I want to thank our premium sponsors for supporting us throughout the year. On the screen, you'll see all of their logos. They support us throughout the year in all of our events and education. We really appreciate their sponsorships, and those sponsors are Baker Tilly, Donegal, Gen Re, Guy Carpenter, Markham, Munich Re, Hartford Steam Boiler, Mutual Boiler Re, Pennsylvania and Indiana Lumbermans, Swiss Re, and Willis Re. So today our presenter is going to be Dr. John Park of Baker Tilly, and special thanks to John Park. He's one of our Premium Gold sponsors. Dr. Park is, he brings a unique perspective to this topic. He began his career over 30 years ago as a commercial property and casualty underwriter at Penn National Insurance. He also spent over 25 years at Penn State focused on teaching and research in leadership, development, and strategic planning. He joined Baker Tilly in 2012 and focused on the identification and development of Baker Tilly's high potential leaders, and as a director in consulting practice, working with clients to facilitate their strategic planning and risk management activities. All the materials that John goes over today will be available to everyone on our website, as well as the presentation, and you should receive an email tomorrow with everything included in it. And during the presentation, you're able to ask questions, and we'll make sure to get to everybody's questions at the end, but at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A button that will allow you to ask John questions throughout the presentation. Before we begin, we're going to do a quick poll. So everyone could just go ahead and answer the poll for me. So it's looking like we have about 75% of yeses. People do have succession plans in place. And we have 29% of people thinking that their succession plan is very, very effective. And it's kind of mixed out along the scale. So I'm going to hand it over to John, and he's going to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Vaughn. Thanks for the polling, and everyone. Pleased to be with the PAMIC group today. And this is a great day to really be using technology. I'm in Philadelphia today working, and it is miserable as far as raining. So I'm pleased to be able to do this with the webinar format. I've been involved in talent management and succession planning really for about the last 20 years. First, while I was at Penn State in different roles there, and then the past 6 years with Baker Tilly. And in that role, really looking at our internal high potentials and looking at how we can extend their careers with us and make them more effective. What I'd like to do today is focus on the broader topic of talent management, and then narrow it down and look at succession planning. And my goal, based on the kind of the feedback from the poll, is to provide you with some best practices, some pitfalls to avoid. For those of you that are involved in succession planning already, that'll allow you to do a little benchmarking. For those of you that are either lacking in this area or don't have a succession plan or talent management approach in place, this will give you some ideas on how you can get started. I really focus on this whole issue of talent. And for so many of us, it becomes really easy to be confident that we have this in place, that we're great at it, that we have it all put together. And really, this quote from the Titanic, who they also felt they had everything in place. And if you're wondering about that, you can really find out more about them. They're up in the North Atlantic sitting there. So perhaps they were a little bit overconfident as well. There's a lot of work being done right now as far as why we need to really have talent management focus in our organizations. And for so many of us, it becomes really easy to focus on the operational, the tactical kinds of things. There's really a strong business case for why we need to be developing our talent in a strategic manner. The first one really is that a lot of research says if we have great workforce management practices, if we're developing our talent, that we have bench strength, we're able to grow. And the data says that for all of us, whether we're a small mutual or a large multinational organization, the baby boomers are going to be retiring. And when we look at some of the data specific to the insurance industry, 88% of the CPCUs right now are over 40 years of age. So if you're looking around your organization or your office right now and there's a lot of gray hair, you really need to be taking this seriously. The other piece of this becomes some of the challenges related to the insurance industry right now, as far as people wanting to get into the field, as far as the brand, the images, and some of the challenges related to that. And that really forces us to take this seriously and to spend the time on it. And that would be one of the takeaways I would encourage everyone listening to do, is you think about your role in your organization, whether you're at a manager level or at a president or CEO level. If you're asked where you spend your time and you say developing people, I would encourage you to track your time for the next month and see how much actual time you are devoting to that. For so many of us, we talk about things, but until we start to measure it, then we really see if that's transferring into action. Most or all of you have heard the definition of insanity before, doing the same thing in the same way and expecting different results. That becomes one of the challenges right now for so many organizations when it comes to talent management. They have a historical perspective, a way that they've done it in the past. The challenge with that is that with new technology, with the changing needs and changing demographics of the workforce, those historic approaches are not going to make it. And I think for so many of us, making that type of shift, being able to lean into that change is difficult. And as we continue to grow as organizations, being able to step back and take that objective look, that's where some key talent management best practices can really be helpful. As I prepared for this webinar and really looked at the research, looked at some of my personal experiences, and also talked to some friends and colleagues around the insurance industry, there are some best practices that keep surfacing. The first one is making a clear connection between your strategy for your organization. If you're in a growth strategy, if you're trying to build internal capacity, if you're focusing on technology, as you recruit talent, making sure that there's a convergence, making sure that your strategy and your approach to recruiting, to developing talent are aligned. The second piece of this, and this becomes, again, challenging at times, is really taking a step back and objectively looking at our current talent pool. How strong are they? What are their competencies? And also being able to develop assessments and performance management systems that are aligned with that strategy. The third piece of it is really from a culture standpoint. And again, more and more organizations are recognizing that technical skills are key, but making sure that we also have the right fit from a culture standpoint, from a values standpoint. As I talk more about succession planning, I'll drill deeper into being able to recognize what the key positions are. For so many of us, our natural inclination is to think about the person at the top, she or he, the president of the company, the CEO. However, when we step back and start to look at other key positions in the organization, what the talent pool looks like there, and as we align that with our growth strategy, those gaps or disconnects can really cause bottlenecks or cause us to really not be able to succeed strategically. The other piece of this becomes, how do we make strategic investments in our key talent? Again, as I talk further about succession planning, once we've identified talent, once we've thought through what those key positions are, we have to be able to maintain that pool in our organization. And that takes money, and that takes investments, and that can be challenging for some of the smaller companies. And I know from a range of some of our smaller mutual companies that are listening in today, we don't have that luxury necessarily of being able to keep people on the bench. But more and more, as you continue to look at what you're going to do over the next 3 to 5 years, it's not an expense, it's an investment. And that's something that I really try to ask people to focus on, is making that flip and thinking of it as an investment versus an expense. And the other piece of this is, and I'm very aware of this, is making sure that we retain the right people. So many times organizationally, we say, well, we have a great retention rate. We retain a high level of our employees. The challenge with that becomes making sure that we're retaining the right people, the ones that fit the culture of the organization, the ones that have not only high potential, but also the ability to perform at a high level. And again, these are some best practices for those of you that are already involved in a talent management or succession planning, that I would encourage you to take a minute to step back and see how you compare in these areas. And as you leave today after this brief webinar, that I really hope you're more curious about some of these things, and you go out and you really drill into them deeper and begin to investigate, how are we really doing in these areas? Daryl Conner wrote a book a few years ago that really has resonated with me. And he talked about the importance of really being able to adapt, to be nimble in how we react to our environment, how we react to opportunities that present themselves in front of us. I believe that this whole area of talent management and succession planning is one of those key areas that it's so easy for us to put it off. It's so easy to focus on the technical side of the business and not take the time to look out beyond the next year or two from a talent standpoint. And really, as we think about this baby boomer generation in front of us, none of us are guaranteed to be able to have good health. None of us are guaranteed to be able to continue to function into our mid-60s or into our 70s. And it becomes so common in organizations for key people to all of a sudden something happens. And then we're scrambling. Then we're trying to be reactive versus proactive. And as you, again, process some of the best practices, some of the pitfalls that I talked to you about today, I really encourage you to take a proactive approach on this versus being reactive. Again, as I prepared for this webinar and I stepped back and did my additional research and looked at some of my personal experiences, there are really some best practices from a talent management standpoint, some things that you really need to merge in and think about those best practices, but also be aware of some of these pitfalls. And the first one that I want to talk about is this idea of confusing the value of position with the individual person that's in the position. And so many times we have high performers, people that are truly great and add a lot of value to our organization. And being able to kind of unbundle and objectively look at that position and how important it is versus that person, so that as you prepare from a talent management standpoint, that you're looking at you're looking objectively at the competencies that are required. You're looking objectively at the value that person adds to the organization, that the position is separate from the person. So that's one pitfall to avoid, that you are looking at job descriptions, you are looking at performance metrics as you build your talent management approach, that you're not just looking at it from an individual person, their charisma, their leadership skills, but rather that position, you've isolated that position to focus on it. The other piece of this is being able to measure the progress that you're making when it comes to managing talent. You know, our first inclination is to look at retention, but are there other metrics that we need to be looking at when it comes to measuring how effective our approach is? Are we promoting people from within? Are we able to strategically look at the different levels in the organization and make sure that we're not creating bottlenecks at a higher up position because we haven't been able to keep the right people? And then the last piece of this really is the natural inclination is to house or to keep talent management and succession planning in human resources. My suggestion is that administratively, that may be the place in your organization to own it. But if you don't have key people on the operations side, your chief operating officer, perhaps your head of underwriting or your vice presidents in those different segments, if they aren't involved in it, if they don't own this process, then the likelihood of it being sustainable, the likelihood of it being something that will be there for a 5, 7, 10-year period of time, it goes way down. So making sure that you've broadened your approach, making sure that you have ownership across the organization in talent management, that's a key pitfall to make sure that you don't fall into that trap. At this point, what I'd like to do is kind of step back from that broader talent management umbrella and really focus on succession planning. And I had Vaughn, if you would please, we had a second question that we wanted to put out to the audience and again, make sure that they're engaged and participating. So if you would go ahead and let them answer this second question, please. Folks, if you'd take a minute and answer this question, why don't mutual insurance companies and their presidents and CEOs have succession plans in place? And some of you may say we have one in place, and if that's the case, then think about it through the lens of organizations that don't have one in place.
We're just waiting on a few responses here, John.
Thanks, Vaughn.
So everyone can see the results now. It looks like the most people answered all of the above, 46%.
And when you look at some of the research that's out there, that's exactly what the case is. Vaughn, if you'd pull that back up for 1 second, please. Thank you. For so many folks, you know, they've really have fallen in love with their jobs, and that I'm curious. The only 7% kind of that resonated with you. But when you start to look at kind of balancing out these three areas, oftentimes it's about a third, a third, a third. People just don't take the time to do this. They're too busy focused on underwriting, claims, the operational side of the business. And again, I'll go back to my earlier statement, folks. For those of you in a senior leadership role, I would encourage you to look at your time over the next 2-3 weeks or even a month and track that time and look at how much of it is going to developing your team, developing your people. And if that's if you're falling short in that area, I think that's an opportunity for you to really begin to to step back strategically. And as you look at the plan for growth and where you're going to be taking your organizations, how you make sure that you find the time to do that. So again, I'd like to drill a little deeper into succession planning now. And thank you, Vaughn. I started to make the business case for why succession planning was important when I talked about the broader idea of talent management in organizations. And really, the baby boomer bubble is continuing to, if we look out across the US, over 40% of our workforce could retire. And the second piece of this comes as why we need to focus on succession planning is this idea of a great divide. In other words, we have this millennial group that's coming on board in their early mid-20s, and then we have a disconnect from into their 30s where organizations have brought new people in, they've had them with them for 3 to 5 years, and they haven't seen opportunities and they've left. So what we're beginning to face is this challenge of not having managers, and we're having to promote young folks into those positions before they're ready. The third piece of this becomes the changing demographics of the workforce. And really, as we look out and begin to match our workforce with our clients, and how do we make sure that we're continuing to build our organizations in a way that they're able to respond to the needs of our clients across our footprints. There's a significant amount of research that says if individuals come in, especially those in that high potential, high performing category, if they're not seeing opportunities, if they're getting promoted early on and then they're plateauing, that their morale and their retention plummets. And again, for small organizations, that can be a challenge. On one hand, we want to hire the best and the brightest, but then how do we keep them? And again, I think so much of that is focused on communications and being able to clearly communicate with those high potentials that you recognize what's going on and that there is a plan for them. Again, there are no guarantees that this will still allow you to maintain those high potentials. But if we don't communicate with them, I can assure you that they will be leaving. As far as technology, that becomes really one of the challenges on a go-forward basis for so many organizations right now. How do we continue to make sure that our workforce is able to keep up with the technological changes and innovations? From a customer service standpoint and an operational effectiveness, there's nothing that can really destroy customer service more than having big disconnects where we have individuals leaving and it takes weeks, months to replace them. And then we're asking other people to pick up their slack, and we all know what happens when that occurs. And finally, and I placed it last, but we recognize that there is regulatory changes, compliance changes that will force organizations to have succession plans in place. For me, there's such a strong business case for it that whether we have to do it or forced to do it or not, that should not be at the top of our list. From a strategic planning standpoint, from a growth standpoint, survey after survey says that what's the biggest worry for CEOs, what's keeping them up at night, is a lack of talent, a lack of managers available to help them grow their businesses. What can be the impact of not having a succession plan? At a governance level, at a board level, having gaps, having disconnects with our board positions. And again, as we continue to look at the landscape for boards across, whether it's a mutual insurance company, a nonprofit, it's becoming increasingly difficult to find qualified and willing talent. And again, if we aren't taking the time to develop our board members, if we're not taking the time to really create passion among them, an ownership and engagement among them, then it will become increasingly difficult to fill board positions. From a strategy level, the impact of no succession plan, on one hand, is obvious as far as losing a key member of our senior leadership team. And again, for me, it becomes one of those things where we almost tend to take that ostrich approach when it comes to succession planning with some of our senior leadership positions. We put our head in the sand and we hope it goes away. We hope people don't leave. And again, I would strongly encourage you to be thinking proactively about this, not reactively. And from a strategy standpoint, continuing to look at, where are our weaknesses? Where are those key positions that if we did lose that one person, whether it be to a health issue or to another career opportunity, how do we make sure that we can make a smooth transition? Again, I mentioned this early on when I talked about talent management. And again, when we begin to think about this whole idea of succession planning, is where are the key positions in the organization? And many times they may be at a lower level, not necessarily at that C-suite level. There can be key positions that are so important from a client service, from a customer satisfaction standpoint, that we need to make sure that we're continuing to focus on those positions and that we have a talent pool in place, that we have that talent development strategy, that we're bringing people in, that we're hiring them in a way that they fit the culture, and that we're able to smoothly replace people as they are promoted or as they do leave. And one of the biggest impacts is this exodus of the high potentials. So much time and effort is put into hiring the right people. And again, from a talent management strategy, if we haven't been able to create career paths, if we haven't been able to communicate with these high potentials that we have in the organization, that we see a future for them, that we're able to, on a regular basis, provide them with positive and encouraging feedback. And then also that we're giving them coaching opportunities that allow them to expand their knowledge, to grow, to learn. If we don't do that, if we aren't really strategic about that, people leave. And in today's economy, there are a lot of opportunities for people to seek out new positions, whether that's within the insurance industry or outside of the industry. Beyond the compliance piece that for all of us is at the back of our minds and being aware of it, how important that is, there are some real strong advantages to really being proactive, to really being focused on how we manage our talent, how we build a succession plan that's really aligned with the organization. One of the big challenges on a go-forward basis will be as we try to grow, if it's geographic growth or if it's growth within a particular service line, if we don't have the talent, if we haven't begun to stockpile it, if we haven't began over the next 2-3 years to really nurture that talent, then that strategy will fail. And I see this in some of the work that I'm doing right now in the financial services industry and in other types of professional services, where organizations are spending considerable time from a growth standpoint to really focus on expanding geographically or to grow through mergers. And one of the big things that they're discovering is at times people aren't willing to move. They aren't willing to try to shift geographically. So as you're beginning to think about growing your organization, have I thought through what are the implications from a talent standpoint? I can't emphasize too much the importance of communicating career paths, the importance of making sure that people know and feel that if they are doing a good job, that they're performing at a high level, that they will be promoted, that there will be other opportunities for them. It's too easy to assume that people can see those opportunities. It's too easy to assume that if we give someone a raise, that they're going to be able to turn that into and appreciate the impact of that. And I guess the challenge here is making sure that we aren't assuming that we understand people. Going back to that first slide on the Titanic, and really for those of you here in a senior leadership position, I really encourage you to be very intentional in being out across your organization to be communicating with those high potentials. If they're in training programs, that you're there spending some time getting to meet them, and they know you, and they understand where the strategy of the organization is headed and what you're focused on. The challenge, again, as I look back across the gamut of organizations represented today, is one of the biggest challenges for small mutuals is, how do we maintain, how do we retain some of our high potentials? And again, there is the financial side of this. And I think the challenge becomes, how do we make that investment? How do we not look at it through that lens of an expense? And how do we, again, strategically stockpile some of that talent so that it doesn't go away? And I go back to that earlier comment on that disconnect, on that divide, where we're continuing to bring in new people, but once they get to a certain level, we aren't able to retain them. And from a succession planning standpoint, that becomes really a critical time for you to be looking at your performance management system. Who are those high performers? And also then, do they have that potential to go to the next level? One of the traps to fall into is that we hire people for the job they're in today. We look at the skill set that they need to be an effective underwriter or effective claims person, but yet recognizing, can we prepare them for 3 to 5 years from now? The other piece of this, it really is from a business case standpoint, especially when we have situations where we have people that are working with large groups of clients, and those relationships become deep. How do we make sure that we're not just relying on one person to manage those relationships? From a talent management, from a succession planning standpoint, how do we make sure that we strategically created opportunities for other people to interact with that client? It's very easy for a senior manager, for a business development salesperson to develop strong relationships with individual clients. From a succession planning, from a talent management standpoint, how do we make sure that that relationship is really focused on the organization, not that one person? And again, that's something that it's really easy to not want to deal with. And again, from a growth standpoint, it really points to the needs for a strategic approach to this. How do we make sure that we have multiple touch points with those clients so that we have deep and broad relationships with them, that they're able to survive, those relationships survive if someone does leave? And the other thing is, I'll go back to some of the challenges facing the insurance industry as far as bringing in new talent. And again, as people are entertaining careers in the insurance industry, if they aren't able to look at your company, to look at your website, or talk to some of your employees and see how people are advancing, and see how people see opportunities within your organization. If you're go online and looking at searches and looking at feedback about your organization, and the reputation isn't positive, then I think you really are forced to think through, are we taking the appropriate method? Are we taking the appropriate strategy as far as developing our talent and our succession planning? I talked about some pitfalls to avoid at the talent management level. There are some real barriers to effective succession planning. And the first one is really a lack of buy-in or interest from senior leadership or at a board level. And again, there are some compliance issues. There are, governance issues that say we need to be doing this. But it becomes really easy to just walk through the motions. It becomes really easy as a CEO at a president level to delegate that responsibility. I really encourage you today to make sure that that's part of when you look at your goals for a year, for the next 3 years, that you really integrate succession planning and talent management into your goals at a C-suite level. The second piece of this becomes kind of an organizational history and culture level. And what I'm talking about here is that if there's been some distrust over the years as far as, people seeing succession plans put in place and nothing's done, or people are given promises about, well, you're going to be given this opportunity, but there's no follow-up. If we're not doing a constant communication, if we're not on a quarterly or regular monthly basis, touching base with some of these high potentials and making sure that again, that we're communicating with them, that the organization values them, and that we're communicating with them in a way that they can see the future. And also recognizing that with some of our C-suite positions, that if folks are, they've worked hard to be promoted in that position over a 20, 30, 40-year period of time. And when they're in that position, at times, they may feel a bit of entitlement or ownership in that position and not be so inclined to want to share that knowledge or to really develop the people behind them. And again, there can be a history or a culture that really has shown that in the past, people that do that are pushed out. So really being able to create a culture where succession planning and talent management is embedded in the organization is really important. And again, I'll go back to the focus on investment versus expense. And again, being able to step back from a budget standpoint and look at what's realistic for us to be investing in our talent. How do we make sure that we're focusing that investment in the right places to get the best return on our investment? And then how are we making sure that we're measuring and focusing organizations? People focus on what gets talked about and measured. If we talk about something and say it's important, but yet we don't have any metrics involved, if we're not measuring it, then many times it just goes by the wayside. How many times in organizations do we set sales goals that are perhaps unattainable? And then at the end of the year, we don't even talk about them. We don't use them as part of our performance management system. So what does a comprehensive approach to succession planning include? What does it look like? This is a constant theme that I'll go back to. It starts with someone at a champion level, at a C-suite position, a senior management position. Someone needs to champion this. Many cases that may be the HR, the chief talent person in an organization. I would encourage you to also make sure that there's someone involved at an operational level. Someone that's involved, either COO or whatever level that is in your individual organization, that's a joint effort, that it's really shows a commitment of senior management to focus on succession planning. The second piece of this is, going back to my higher level discussion on talent management, is making sure that we do take the time to integrate it into our strategic plan, that it becomes a strategic initiative as part of that planning process, and that we make sure that we set down and systematic planned it. In other words, we've gone through that process of identifying what are those key positions in our organization. And then the second step being that we've gone through and we've looked at that gap between our existing people. How good are they? How do they measure up? Not only in today, but how will they measure up in 3 to 5 years from now? And what are those gaps? Are they training gaps? Is the root cause that we're not hiring the right people? Are we bringing in the right people, but we're losing them for some reason? And again, then slowing down and taking the time to really investigate and understand what's going on. The other piece of this is, over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of work done with competency models, really looking at individual positions and seeing what does it take to perform at a high level in that position. You know, what are the competencies that are needed? And in smaller organizations, so many times we just don't take the time to really identify those competencies in our management positions, in our key positions. And again, making sure that you understand where those key positions are, not just at a CEO or COO level, but really those competency models look at all of those other key positions in your organization. Having specific goals, having accountability, having metrics to measure your succession planning strategy, your succession planning process. If you don't make people accountable for it, it becomes one of those afterthoughts. If someone at a senior level isn't holding others accountable, if it isn't part of their performance review, if it isn't part of an attempt to strategically grow the organization, then it's an afterthought. It can become a piece of paper or a document that sits somewhere, and once in a while people dust it out. Or it can be something that you show from a governance standpoint or from a regulation standpoint. I would strongly encourage you that I've tried to make the business case today for being proactive in really embracing the need to manage your talent, embracing the need to have succession plans in place. And again, beginning to find ways to create budget items to account for this, that we begin to strategically work with our CFO to say what is realistic from an investment standpoint. You know, how do we refocus funds? How do we make sure that we've allocated some financial resources to our high potentials? How do we make sure that we're taking the time in our quarterly or monthly meetings to talk about our succession plans, that it becomes a regular piece of the organization, not just our discussions on our loss ratio or our revenue or budgeting things, but rather making this an integral part of our organization. I apologize to those of you that aren't Yankees fans, but this is Derek Jeter, who is maybe one of the best shortstops to ever play the game for the Yankees. Interestingly enough, he's transitioned into an administrative role now in professional baseball, and I think perhaps he's looking at it from a much different lens and maybe learning some lessons. But this quote, when I prepared for this webinar, this quote really resonated with me. You don't just accidentally show up in the World Series. Ladies and gentlemen, as you think about the futures of your organization, you aren't going to just accidentally end up with the right person there to run your organization, or you're not going to accidentally end up with the right person to step into that underwriter manager role or that claims manager role. It's rather being able to step back and systematically think about where we're taking our organization, being able to objectively look at the people that we have in place now, our current talent pool. How successful are they? Are they capable and willing to step into other roles down the road? And then at times being able to make those tough decisions that some folks just aren't maybe the right match, and being able to suffer maybe that short-term pain as far as being able to move someone into a different role and bring someone else in or transfer someone, but being able to make those decisions in a strategic way, in an empathetic way that takes into account, people's feelings, but also what's right for your company. I shared some best practices from a talent management program, or from a talent management standpoint, excuse me. I'd like to share a few best practices from a succession planning standpoint as well. Accountability is critical. Identifying those critical key positions and making sure that you're not just focusing at the top, that you're really stepping back and looking at the entire organization. Administratively, what are those roles? from an underwriting, from a claims standpoint. What are those key roles in each of those functional areas? Making sure that your performance management system is really accomplishing what you wanted to do. In other words, you're able to reward your high performers. You're able to provide them systematic and relevant feedback. Making sure that, again, that you're constantly, that this isn't a once and done type of thing, but you're constantly assessing the talent in your organization and you're identifying those gaps, that you're able to do it using perhaps some assessments, a series of competency models. In other words, again, I would encourage you, I'm spending about an hour with you today and scratching the surface on some of these areas, but I really encourage you to go out and do more research, to be more curious about some of these areas. And again, that you have the senior leader champions in place. That is probably the most critical piece of moving a talent management and succession plan forward, is having senior leader champions, having them actively engaged, not just delegating that to someone else, but they're involved in it. They're really very present. They're visible in the process. I've talked about how you evaluate the effectiveness of a succession planning effort. These are some samples of some things for you to consider as you leave this call or this webinar, and go back and look at your succession planning and talent management approach. How much downtime in your positions? How long does it take you to fill them? What's the cost of your searches? Are you doing them internally? Many times those are hidden costs. We talk about, oh, this doesn't cost much, but when we start to look at the time at a functional level, at an HR, at a talent management level, then we start to assign a value to those. How much is it truly costing us to do searches? Are we retaining people? Are we retaining the right people? Again, on a constant basis at a senior level, bringing this to the table in your senior leadership meetings, in your C-suite meetings. Again, people focus what gets talked about and measured. Who will be held accountable? Do you have the voice of the customer in this? Are you talking to your clients? Are you getting their perspective on the new talent that you're bringing on board? What type of interactions are they having with your new folks that you're bringing on board? How often are people promoted? If people do leave the organization, how do you manage them out? How do you make sure they leave with a positive impression of your organization? Do you have some divides in your organization where people get to a certain level and then they're leaving? Are you able to really take the time to track that and look at that? And then finally, and again, there's a lot of metrics related to employee engagement and satisfaction right now, but there is significant research that says high potentials and across an organization, their satisfaction level goes up if they have a career path, if they can see a future in front of them. They're much more likely to stay. They're much more likely to be patient. Excuse me. Technology got in front of me there a little bit. The reality of it is, and Thomas Friedman wrote a book a few years ago called The World is Flat. And in it, he talks about the idea that it doesn't matter if we're at the top of the food chain or the bottom of the food chain. We need to be proactive. We need to be running. We need to be moving. I would really encourage you, those of you that feel confident in your succession plan right now, that you don't take that for granted, that you're continuing to go back and look at it and say, is this sound? Are there gaps? Are there disconnects? For those of you that are recognizing that you don't have a succession plan or you're just getting started, then really beginning to set it from a strategy standpoint, to look at some of those best practices that I've talked about today, that you look at some of those pitfalls to avoid. There are some challenges that realistically you have to face when it comes to succession planning. One of them is, it's not something that we can do overnight. It's not something that happens in 6 weeks or even 6 months, but rather it's a transformation that you begin to make out over the next 2-3 years. And really, the second piece of this becomes, uh, at times, either being overly positive or maybe overly negative about our existing talent, but they're really able to step back and begin to identify those key competencies and then look at how people are measuring up against those competencies. How do we make sure that we keep senior level interest in this? That's one of the key things that I've seen in some of the organizations I've worked with closely is if that champion, if there's continuity there, if that person stays engaged and involved, then the message is clear that this is important. If that person is only involved for a short period of time and then they move on to something else, then the inference is that, yeah, this was important, but not so much. So I'm not going to focus on it. Making sure that from a budget standpoint, that we, again, begin to allocate the right amounts of money. And again, this isn't something that you can do overnight, but you begin to build that capacity in your organization to make these investments. And again, back to that senior level support, that it's consistent, that it's clear, that people see the senior leadership values this and they value the talent in the organization. So, what does it take to make this happen? It takes vision. Thoreau talked about the question's not what you look at, but what you see. You can see this as an expense, or you can see this as an opportunity. You can see it as a cost, or you can see it as an investment. I would encourage each of you to think about your team members, your talent as really the lifebloods of your organization, and making sure that you're tracking how much time and money and emotional energy you invest in the talent in your organization. The second piece of this is, as you continue to face challenges in the environment, whether they're weather-related challenges, whether the shifting demographics of your customer base, or the baby boomer bubble that's going to be facing your organization, you really have to go into this with the idea of taking the time to plan, taking the time to think strategically about what we're trying to do with our organization. So many times we get our heads down, we focus on that day-to-day functional areas, and then the environment changes and our organization isn't prepared. We don't have the right people in place, or some disaster occurs and we haven't even taken the time to anticipate it or think about it. Travis Bradbury has done a lot of writing on emotional intelligence, and he talks a lot about behavior change and what it takes to change a behavior at an organizational or personal level. The reality of it is that to implement succession planning, to implement a talent management approach, a strategic approach, there will be some discomfort. There will be some uneasiness as you take the time to think about the culture of your organization. You take the time to make sure that your behaviors and what you say is important is consistent with what you're doing. And again, we have to embrace that and lean into it. And that starts at the top. And it starts from a senior leadership level. If succession planning, if talent management is supposed to be a key driver of success, then people must be willing to change, to question, to be curious about how they can continue to grow and get better. I crafted some succession planning questions for you as we wrap up our hour together. And Vaughn had mentioned that these will go out to you. For me, the first one is, will senior leadership take the time to be involved? Have you taken the time to identify those critical positions in your organization? Again, beyond the C-suite, what are those other ones? Do you have a strategy in place to kind of systematically look at who those high potentials are in your organization, and make sure that you remember there's a difference between high performance and high potential. And I would encourage you to drill deeper into that area to understand it better. And the other piece is, do you have career paths in place? Are you creating structured opportunities for your employees, for your high potentials and other people around your organization? We have about 5 minutes left. Vaughn was tracking some questions for us. I'm going to pull them up right now. I'm going to take a quick look at them and try and answer. I have 3 questions here. And then from that, we'll make sure that we send out emails to everyone as far as some answers to the questions. The first question is, a lot of mutual insurance companies don't have succession plans because they don't have people capable of advancing. How should these organizations tackle succession planning? That's a great question. I talked about that a little bit, and I really think that it becomes starting to identify those key positions in your organization first. And once you've identified those key positions, then you can begin to develop a strategy for sustaining them. But if you haven't made that first step of really identifying key positions and where they're at, and also then what are the people currently in those positions' intention as far as, do they intend to be there till they're 55, till they're 60, and beginning to kind of go through that analysis, almost a spreadsheet of, okay, these are the key positions, these are the people in them, and then do we have a successor available? If we don't, then we begin to develop that strategy. The second question is focused on the board of directors. And again, I mentioned this a little bit, and being sensitive to the time we have, again, for me, it all starts with having a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities of your board. And once you do that, and then you begin to look at your existing board, you can see how you want to manage the input of new ideas, new knowledge. The other piece of this becomes, what kind of term limits do you have with your board members, if any? And again, this becomes a challenge for organizations, and I've seen this with a couple clients I've worked at, where their board early on, when they were smaller, their boards were very hands-on, very much involved in the operation and the decision-making process. As the organization grew, the organization needed that board to become more strategic, to be more governance-focused. Some individuals embraced that, they understood it. Others struggled with it. And again, that becomes the need to continue to evaluate your board and how is it performing, and how do the board members, what are they getting out of it? And how do you continue to look at those roles and responsibilities as they shift, make sure that they're aligned with the strategic direction of the organization? The last question is focused on being a CEO, and because of the time we have left, I'm going to defer that question, and I'll work with Vaughn to summarize my responses to the questions we have. If anyone else would like to send in any questions or get those into this, we'll put out a follow-up document that addresses these so that everyone has them. And that'll give me an opportunity to have some additional thoughts about the questions that we have. So I want to thank everyone for today's session. Vaughn, do you want to wrap us up here today?
Yeah, just want to thank everybody for attending today. We hope that you found John's presentation valuable. We also want to thank John himself for presenting with us today. If you have any questions, feel free to email him. We're going to summarize, like he said, the questions that we couldn't get to today. We're going to have another webinar coming up on March 22nd covering the impact of the assignment of benefits on characters, and that's going to be hosted by Scott Ribney of Rebar Burnsteel and Michael Zimmerman of Goodville Mutual Casualty Insurance. So that should be another great webinar. And again, I want to thank our Premium Gold sponsors for their support throughout the year. And thanks again to everyone for attending.